2NURFM.com, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.
Thanks to Sugar Valley Lifestyle Estate, West Wallsend, our sponsor. Good morning to you, Jim. I mentioned a moment ago it's 800 years old. What relevance does it have to us today? I was speaking about the Magna Carta, probably jumping the hoops a bit early. What actually is the Magna Carta, Jim?
Yeah. Good morning, Meryl. Well, the Magna Carta is a document that was started out as a peace treaty between the barons and King John back in 1200. It was signed in 1215, hence its 800th anniversary today. Its value for us, I suppose, in Australia is more symbolic than literal. The value is about its meaning within the sort of traditions and practices of English liberal democracy. It's interpreted by many in all sorts of different ways to suit their various purposes. I think we talk about the Magna Carta in a very loose way, but what we're actually referring to in real terms is the document that was eventually signed and declared in 1297 by Edward I. No, sorry, I think I probably got the number wrong, but it was King Edward.
Yes.
And we have a copy of that original one in the Australian Parliament. So that's a sort of quite amazing thing. But to come back to its political significance, most of the clauses or the provisions of the Magna Carta have sort of long since disappeared in terms of actual practice. They are mostly concerned with pre-feudal and feudal issues. Only 3 of the key clauses now sort of survive. And perhaps the most important one for our contemporary purposes is the provision that guaranteed that no free man would be subjected to trial or arbitrary arrest, or that they would be subjected to arbitrary judgment. They had to be judged by a jury of their peers. So in broad terms, that provision sort of is very central, if you like, to how we understand modern democracies working and modern democratic societies working. The appeal to the Magna Carta by various sides of politics is more a symbolic process. The nature of the Magna Carta has long since disappeared. It serves a major sort of almost ideological and reassuring view that we can trace back some of these provisions, some of these liberties,
is it a bit like
about 800 years.
Is it a bit like the Hippocratic Oath in medicine? First do no harm. It's the overarching principle of it, more so than the actual detail. Is that a good analogy or parallel?
Yeah, more or less. I think that we need to sort of understand that it's not something that we can take literally anymore, given that only three of the original provisions have survived. Over the years, they've been gradually repealed in the sense that they no longer form part of the law of the land, so to speak. But the symbolic value of the sort of basic liberties that you can't be imprisoned without a fair trial, that you be judged by a jury of peers, that justice can't be bought and sold. I think there was an affirmation, I think that's still in there in fact, around the provision of the freedom of the English Church, that I think is clause number 1 now. And the actual numbering of the Magna Carta, the clauses in the Magna Carta actually didn't emerge until around about the 1700s. The original form of the Magna Carta is one continuous document without sort of paragraph numbering, if you like, or numbering according to clauses. But this provision that arbitrary arrest, detention without trial, all of those sorts of things are sort of, if you like, for us, the sort of Hippocratic, the equivalent of or analogous to the Hippocratic Oath. And, it's quite interesting that in our contemporary times, that many of the debates now around, say, for example, refugees, asylum seekers, terrorism statutes and anti-terrorism measures, all of these are built, shall we say, I guess, not so much contravening this particular clause, but, shall we say, writing, sort of disregarding it to some extent, so that the spirit that we might draw out of the Magna Carta as a sort of spirit of our sort of democratic practices seems to be more honoured in the breach than in the actual practice.
Yes, okay. I was going to ask you about relevance today, but I think you've touched on it there. There is still a relevance for the Magna Carta today in that it is a guiding light and a principle to our jury and our legal system as well, isn't it? Even though that's often precedent-based these days and case-by-case base, and it's obviously evolving, but there is still that, standard, if you like.
Yeah, I think that's right, but I think also we need to remember that it emerged as a product, shall we say, of attempts by the barons of the time back in the 1200s to rein in the rights of the monarch. And there are two really powerful dimensions to this. One is reining in the right of the monarch to levy taxation whenever the monarch felt like it, in particular to wage wars and to force the barons to support those wars, whether or not they had any agreement to them. But the second and really important one was that the monarch was drawn back into a web of, shall we say, practices and legal relationships in which the monarch was not above the law. In John's time, in King John's time, and perhaps before, and probably up until at least the English Civil War in the 1600s, the monarchs saw themselves as empowered by divine authority, and that they were above the laws of the land, and that whatever they did, provided it was consistent with how they understood, shall we say, God's law and papal law at the time, could more or less do as they pleased. What the Magna Carta did, and this is the second most important thing, I think, that it enabled, if you like, the people below monarch level, the barons in particular, that to rein in the monarch and to keep the monarch operating according to the rule of law. Whatever the law of the land was at the time, the monarch was not above it. And we also need to remember that the free men of the time were really the barons and the knights. The vast majority of the population were subjects of the king or the queen, and they were simply only as free as those above them permitted them to be. But the first, shall we say, basis for changing all of that emerges with the barons rebelling against the monarch.
And the Magna Carta. Well, they say it's worth 30 million. That's our copy. We're certainly not putting it up on eBay for sale. We're going to hang on to it. Professor Jim Jones, thanks so much for giving us a little bit more insight on this important document, the Magna Carta.
My pleasure, Meryl.
See you next week.
Yeah, see you next week.
Set the date. That's the one. We'll talk again next Tuesday, just after 9:15 to Professor Jim Jones. Thanks to our sponsor, Lifestyle Estate, Sugar Valley Lifestyle Estate, West Wallsend.